Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. As always, we thank you for watching our programs, whether on TV in St. Vincent and the Grenadines or on our YouTube and Facebook pages, Page Turners Plus. Today, we'll be discussing Angela Barry's The Drowned Forest. To tell you a bit more about The Drowned Forest and Angela Barry, we have Kesiwa. Kesiwa?
Good afternoon. Told through a group of characters brought together in shared responsibility for Genesis, a young adolescent on the verge of incarceration, and by Genesis herself. In The Drowned Forest, Angela Barry explores a clashing of subcultures, each with a sense that their Bermuda, where the novel set, is the one that possesses the island's virtues. There is Nina, from the respectable black middle class, with her own grief, prickly uncertainties, and moral hang-ups. Lizzie, fighting for her own space in a Portuguese family which is railing against the changing times. Tess, battling with some guilt over her white privilege and her reluctance to lose its benefits. And Hugh, an expat Welshman who has come to the island to find himself. Barry weaves a rich and absorbing narrative in which these different perspectives, insider, outsider, youth, older person, black, white, are each given somewhat sympathetic space and a sense of growth through the span of the novel. In the character of Genesis, she creates a dynamic and winning portrayal of the energies, hopes, conscience, and vulnerabilities of youth. Beyond the human world with all its divisions, there are the little-known islands of Bermuda, for whose stunning beauties and sometimes urban ugliness, Barry has a vividly descriptive eye. And Angela Barry herself is Bermudian by birth, and she's lived abroad for more than 20 years in England, France, the Gambia, Senegal, and the Seychelles. And she returned to Bermuda to work as a lecturer, where she worked until she retired in 2016. And this is not her first novel by any means. She's the author of Endangered Species and Other Stories and Gory Point of Departure. And she's contributed to a couple of anthologies, So Many Islands and New Daughters of Africa.
Thank you very much, Kesiwa. And I guess we could jump off straight from your synopsis and ask, is The Drowned Forest a novel more about community than it is about sisterhood? And who wants to start with that?
Yeah, this I thought it was a challenge, and it's a challenging aspect of the novel. Is it more of community, is it more of sisterhood? Um, I would lean toward that it's more community, and the reason I come down there is because of Genesis' relationship with Uriel, and also the characters like Uncle Jack and Rosie, who bring a different perspective. But um, I also get a sense of it being community because it is set. Well, some of the novel is set around the cup match, so the emancipation celebration that occurs annually on the island of Bermuda. So I think with that, I think that uh, the core characters are all women, and we see the interplay among those women. But still, I think the communal aspect of Bermuda set in with the early 2000s comes out, I think, better and more vivid.
Paula?
No, I don't have anything to add. I agree with Eric that it is the community aspect is stronger. There's a strong sense of sisterhood as well. But I think community is more important to this novel.
I disagree with Paula and agree. Sorry, Christine.
Go ahead. I think I might agree with what you're going to say. So.
I was going to disagree with Paula and agree with Eric because I think community does come through really strongly but I also think intergenerational relationships are really important. Like you mentioned, the relationship with Uncle Jack and with Rosie. And also between the women themselves, I don't think there is really any sense of sisterhood. Each of them has their kind of own angles and their own separate relationships, but it's more competitive than convivial, I would say. They kind of are brought together because of the character of Genesis, but they don't have a friendship or relationship really beyond her. And as much as they kind of respect each other, it's only when things go well with Genesis, because when things go wrong with Genesis, they quickly rip into each other as well. So I don't even think it's really... I think you would imagine it might be about sisterhood because there are these female characters, but I don't think it really is. It's much more about the community that Genesis is able to create. I would argue.
I was gonna say I'm gonna throw something else into the mix that what I saw more was a sense of family, not so much community. I think it was more focused on on the family units of each of the characters. Like you had Genesis, who became a part of Nina's family, which included Uncle Jack and Rosie. When we looked at Lizzie, it was all about her family. And the same with Tess. I mean, she focused a lot on her ancestors and stuff. I saw really more the sense of family coming out than community. Even with Genesis, with Uriel, it was like Uriel was her family. To
Mhm.
me, it was really more family than communities, more so. And I definitely agree with Kesua that I did not see sisterhood at all. Like they were really like they had literally nothing in common apart from Genesis, and they didn't seem to build that much of a sense of sisterhood even towards the end.
Mhm. Yeah, I thought there was like a real distrust between Nina and Tess. I mean, we see it come out later in the novel, but you can feel that tension throughout. Um, it was just building throughout with the different backgrounds of the women. I was just waiting for it to come out, and I'm glad it did. I'm glad Angela Barry was honest in that appraisal of a relationship with, yeah, a black respectable like Nina and Tess. But you would think that those two would have more in common. Because Nina definitely does play up the black respectability politics, but um no, she distrusts Tess and everyone like her.
And you see why, right? Because when things get difficult, Tess is leaning back on her wealth and her privilege and other people to deal with things for her. Um, but I also really love the way that Angela Barry doesn't shy away from those tensions that are present throughout. She really just jumps straight in there. Like no stone is left unturned in terms of the minutia of the social relations in a space like Bermuda, which I think we can all agree we'll see similar things across the Caribbean, right?
I mean, I think I definitely agree that there's an overarching theme of community, but for me, I think Angela Barry highlighted more the lack of togetherness in the Bermudian community than anything else, because you have such wide disparities between them. And for example, you have young people like Uriel and Genesis who are clearly abandoned by the society that they grew up in. And for example, it was mentioned quite a few times, especially in the histories part of the novel, that Bermuda is 21 square miles, which is a tiny island. We can't get past that. Yet, you would think, especially, and we could call Bermuda a sort of Caribbean country based on culture and history, that they would have some sort of togetherness that you would expect on an island, but you have that lack of togetherness, lack of cohesion, where Genesis and Uriel are abandoned, and then at some point later in their lives, when I assume it might be too late to save them, that's just my assumption. They're picked up by these three women and sort of looked after. So I think there's an overarching theme of community, but the way the theme was portrayed, in my view, was that there's a lack of cohesion within that community.
But Bermuda is portrayed in the novel as different than the Caribbean in terms of the English speaking Caribbean, I should say, in terms of certainly population. The large white population that exists in Bermuda doesn't exist anywhere in the Caribbean, anywhere in the English speaking Caribbean. There's also a large segment of the society which is made up of expats, and that alone will um, well will influence the lack of cohesiveness. I would imagine that if there's a large expat community, you're not going to have the cohesiveness that you would have in a society where everybody's ancestors has been there for centuries. Um,
That is a very true point.
I don't know if I'd agree with that. I think expat communities often keep to themselves. What they allow is for a social buffer, that there are bars and restaurants where everyone can jump into. You don't have to be a part of the wider community in a way that you can't avoid. But I don't think it necessarily means that there's no cohesion apart from that. I think it's interesting what you said about the large white population, because in terms of numbers, I'm not sure, but it reminds me a lot of Barbados. I think the difference, perhaps, and I don't know Barbados well enough to know, is that the white population of Barbados seems quite comfortable, and similarly, it reminded me a lot of the idea that they have this kind of other space that they occupy, and there's often no, what's the word, serious connection between them and the wider Black community, right? They've ruled for hundreds of years, and they live their best lives quite separately and quite apart from, and often in a position above, right? Did no one else get that connection? Because that's for me what it reminded me, but it didn't feel so crazy
No, it
different to
didn't
other
remind
places
me
in
of
the
that at
Caribbean.
all. So I went and I did the research. And actually, this book was wonderful in that way. It gives you little nuggets of information, and it encourages you to go and do the research, because I think I spent as much time doing research around the circumstances of the novel, the historical circumstances, the current political situation, as I did reading the novel. But if the things I've read online are correct, the African population is only about 60% of the society. That is a very low number for the English-speaking Caribbean. Usually we're upward, I mean, apart from Guyana and Trinidad, we're usually upward of 80% of the population. So that is highly unusual.
Yeah, it really. I'm glad we're talking about this, because I saw so many similarities, even in language, food, with the broader U.S. South, and also particularly New Orleans, which we're an island to ourselves, and as long as I was living there, and still, uh, the Black population is hovers 60 and 65% of the city, but we occupy that low space social economically, in that space. But we've had some Black political leadership since I was a boy, but I just saw the same type of dynamics uh, in Angela Barry's Bermuda in the book that I saw in my own hometown. Um, and I found it interesting. It's another point related to this topic. I found it interesting that Nina's people, she wasn't Bermudian through and through. Her people had come from the Turks, and it seemed as though they came from the Turks post emancipation. Uh, But what's also interesting about Nina is her broader consciousness. That, I mean, when she toward the end of the text, when she interacts and really lays into Tess about that history that Tess has, her family has on that island. I mean, she speaks as though she's Bermudian and her family were enslaved on that island. So I really appreciated that aspect, that Nina put herself within the broader context of African and African descendant experiences in the Caribbean, and probably with throughout the Americas. Period.
But if you, I'm sure most of us have read the biography, Mary Prince's biography, and Mary Prince did move between the Turks and Bermuda. So I think perhaps they have a historical there is a historical movement between those islands that has been going on for centuries. I don't know, because Bermuda to me is an unknown quantity. I know zero about Bermuda. Everything I've learned about
Mm.
Bermuda, almost everything, I learned after I read this novel, because I went looking.
And isn't that the joy of literature?
But then oh, Tony, did you want to get in here or?
Well, I have the benefit of making the last comment on the original question about community and sisterhood. So I think Angela Barry was deliberate in setting out the layered society, the layered nature of the Bermudan society. She was very deliberate in doing that. Was the book, sorry to take you back to the question, Roger, but was the book about community or sisterhood? I listened to your answers, all of you, and I think there's a blend of everything. There were certainly communal events that were significant in the novel, as Eric mentioned, the cup match or the cricket match, and that's what the carnival, the African legacy festival. Can't remember what it was called in Bermuda, but we know of such type festivals across the Caribbean, different names. So those were the cohesive events that you saw everybody participating in coming in their layered cloak and but coming to this this one event. Sisterhood, I agree with Kessa. Well, I thought that was more of a competitive dynamic going on there. I didn't see the sisterhood part. But the other thing I wanted to say, Kessa made the comparison with Barbados and Bermuda. I would throw in Cayman Islands as more of a similar type of setup. Why? Because very wealthy, a lot of money, 21 square miles, you say, and the billions of dollars in Bermuda because of the nature of the economy. But who participates in this great wealth? It's not the black people, right? And there brings the troubled present of Bermuda as much as it has a troubled past. And I think Barry is skillfully bringing the reader into that stream of consciousness, yeah, throughout the novel, and she's doing it through Genesis and You, which is go back to Sherry Jones's tone and maybe, but you get where I'm coming from. That layer, and then there's the privileged layer that Tess represents, yeah, and the airhead layer, and so on and so forth, right? So I think the novel, as Paula said as well. Sorry for talking so long, but you left me out for a very long time, right? As Paula said, I learned a lot about Bermuda through this novel. It sort of put Bermuda in the context of what a shared history for the rest of the Caribbean is. That was a missing piece for me, and Angela Barry was able to bring that around.
But you talk about the rest of the Caribbean. Bermuda is not in the Caribbean.
Well, the rest of the Caribbean, yeah, that's true.
I don't know if Black Bermudians feel like they're not part of the Caribbean. I feel like that's. I feel like
they're not in the Caribbean.
Yes, so, I went to school.
They're not in the Caribbean.
With a few Bermudans. I was telling Roger this off camera. Black males that I met from Bermuda, I didn't meet any females, but the black males that I met identify themselves more with the American pop culture. For sure. They even spoke with an American accent, for Christ's sake. You know, what is the Bermudan accent anyway? Can anybody tell me?
I've got a couple of Bermudian friends, and they have kind of a tilt, like a Caribbean lilt, sometimes mixed with a slightly British twang. That's for me. They both have that, or a slightly American twang, but it's not a typical kind of strong like Grenadian or Bajan accent in that kind of way. I mean, I think we should be really clear that Bermuda is not a post-colonial society by any stretch, right? It's a British overseas territory.
That's correct.
So it has a very particular kind of political status when you compare it with the English-speaking Caribbean. But maybe for me, the reason I saw some parallels is because the time I spent in Martinique and Guadeloupe, because there are very strong similarities with the French-speaking Caribbean, I think, particularly when it comes to the racial dynamics of the area. There's a large white population, a large transient white population as well as a large black population. It's the descendants of enslaved Africans. So that I kind of recognized a lot of the tensions that she describes, and also that question of like, you know, what does sovereignty mean? What does freedom mean in this context? What does decolonization mean in this context? And the way that people have to grapple with a present day colonial status while we're pretending to be in a post-colonial reality. And I thought she drew out lots of the kind of tensions that I saw in the French Caribbean, in the Francophone Caribbean, beautifully. Sorry, I kind of got off track there.
Yeah, but she also was deliberate in looking at the evolution of the Bermudan economy with that tourism experiment, right? And that I felt was a significant part of what her narrative was, and how the original or the natives, I hate to use these words, you know, they have connotations. When I use natives, I think of people, white people, calling us islanders or natives. It's a different connotation altogether, right? But anyway, for the purpose of this discussion, the people who had driven off their land, so that we could get this tourism product going, and that has created up to today tension, tension that that Angela Barry is bringing out in this brilliant novel, Drowned Forest. So she was deliberate in a lot of stuff, and that is why I found this book so engaging.
I think the other. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just about to say that I like the direction that this discussion was going in terms of how Angela Barry addresses a lot of the historical events in Bermuda in the novel. And I think this would be a good time to take the reading where she describes within the novel a sort of volatile situation that developed in Bermuda, and there is historical precedence for it, and it did happen. So we'll now take the reading from Angela Barry, and when we come back, we'll continue the discussion. Stay tuned.
My name is Angela Barry, and I'm the author of the novel The Drowned Forest. The Drowned Forest is a book about Bermuda, and it looks at the life of a young woman, a young girl who becomes a young woman, who's in trouble, who is assisted by 3 adult women from different backgrounds in Bermuda. And the whole process finds the young woman changing, but it also requires the adult women to change as well. This first reading sees Nina, a very important, in fact, probably the most important of the 3 women, who becomes the guardian of the young girl. But in this particular excerpt, she's remembering a day over 20 years before when serious hostilities broke out in the island and also in her marriage. At dawn that day, 2 men convicted of assassinating the English governor had shuffled towards the death chamber. By the time their bodies hung lifeless from the gallows, black rage had broken out and set the island on fire. Since the arrest of the 2 men, Nina had watched the slow transformation of her husband, Dee. Before, they'd always been on the same page. Now, for the first time in their marriage, she and Dee were openly at war. After only a few minutes at home from work that evening, he'd headed for the door. "Where you going?" "Out," he said, without looking back, and roared out of their yard on his motorbike. Nina had paced up and down in their small apartment, alternating between fury and tears. She knew where he was going. In the months, weeks, and days leading up to the trial, sentence, appeal, and execution, she'd watched the mutation of Dee's tranquil spirit from bewilderment to frustration to outrage. With death in the air and fire and smoke in the streets, she felt a hot wind blowing her husband towards action. She'd pulled on her long denim shirt against the cold December night and headed towards the smoke. But her mission was not to change the world. Hers was to change Dee, to change his mind, to pull him back. She could not let Dee get involved in this violent night. When she'd looked into his eyes before he'd left, she couldn't find him, or even his good, kind father whom he so resembled. All she could see was his mother, Rosie, hardcore when it came to right and wrong. Damn Rosie. Hurrying down the winding lanes, she replayed Dee's and Rosie's conversations as the trials ground on. The talk always ended with his father, Johnny, dead over a decade before. He'd never voted, had died before one person, one vote. The only Bermuda that Johnny knew was the no blacks in hotels Bermuda, the no blacks in the civil service Bermuda, the no blacks in restaurants Bermuda, the no blacks occupying certain seats in movie theaters and churches Bermuda, the no blacks contaminating white schools Bermuda, the segregation without end Bermuda. This was what was pushing Dee, the weight of his dead father and all who'd gone before him. As she carved a path towards the sounds of crackling and shouting, what drove her was a fear of what the attempt to right the wrongs of so many generations would do to her man. Suddenly, she stopped short. In front of her was a liquor warehouse. One side was engulfed in flames. Figures were moving in the darkness, brisk, bent over. The air reeked of kerosene. A lighted bottle flew, shattered a window, and was devoured by the burning building. A tall man stood up, a bottle in one hand, a lighter in the other. Dee! He saw her. She ran to him and grabbed the hand holding the lighter. Go home, Nina. His voice was gravel, his eyes hard and staring. I can't be the only one not doing something.
And welcome back. So, from the reading, Angela Barry gave us a sense of one of the historical events that she covered in the novel. And there are many examples of this laced throughout the entire novel. It is quite almost a historical novel, if you want to call it that. So, the question that I want to ask the panel is, what are your thoughts on how Angela Barry treated historical events in the Drowned Forest? Eric, you look like you're excited to start.
I am. I think I want to go back to the point that Tony raised right before we took the reading about the 1920s, if my memory serves me correct, the 1920s when a group of white Bermudians, uh, really like colonialists in that sense, got this plan to uh, basically take some land away from folk, from black folk, on a certain section of the island, and then turn it into a tourist area to attract big money from the United States. I mean that's a disturbing part of the history, but it's shared in other parts of in parts of the Caribbean. I mean, be sensitive to Paula here. The parts of the Caribbean, since Bermuda sits right in the middle of the Atlantic, but with parts of the Caribbean and other parts of, say, like of the Gulf Coast of the United States, um, and it disturbed me because it's the reality, the way she pulls that story in, the legacy and the realities of the present day realities are palpable, and they have not gone away. And that particular turn in history definitely changed the fortunes of the island, but in uneven and inequitable ways.
They happen to be, I don't know if it's still going on, but like I said, this novel sent me researching, and I found footage of a hearing that's pretty current. I think it was going on up to 2021. A commission of inquiry into the forceful removal of those people from that community that was converted into this expat oasis. Um, and one thing I want to say about about the history and how the novel deals with history is that the novel actually puts real people. The Dinah Smith, that the lady who refused to to leave the town, she's actually a real person. And James, oh, what was his name? James Jemmy uh, Darrell. I think that was his name. He was the person who sounded the ocean. He was actually a real person too. So I was really excited because very few novelists weave in the history as expertly as Angela Barry did. I you all know I hate Island Beneath the Sea. That is a perfect example of how not to deal with historical events. You do not stop the story and give us some historical details and then start the story over. You just throw in some crumbs and let us go and do the research, which is what Angela Barry did, and she did it marvelously because I did a lot of research after I read this novel because she did enough to provoke my interest and for me to suspect that these things were real. And because she put in the grains of suspicion in my head, I went and did the research.
I also really enjoyed the way that she wove history into the novel. One of the things that I particularly found valuable is how she reminded us that what happened 100 years ago was yesterday. You know, that there are people that remember it, that live with the consequences in very real and tangible everyday kind of ways. And that because it happened 100 years ago doesn't mean we should forget it, because that benefits absolutely no one except perhaps the transgressors. And even then, they are haunted by it, and their descendants are haunted by the decisions they made. So nobody wins when we pretend that what happened didn't happen. I think she did that wonderfully. It's something I fight with my students all the time. It wasn't that long ago. And she really highlights that. So thank you, Angela Barry.
What I liked was how she very deftly pointed out that the history has been lost and the younger generation aren't aware of it by having Genesis do this project and find out all these things and also insist to Hugh that the stuff that he was doing needed to be taught in the schools and it should not just be something that was given to the people who already knew about it. And I think that was her way of saying, hey, we need to make sure that the younger generations actually learn this stuff that, as Keswa said, really were not that long ago. But oh, Paula, I just wanted to say one thing though about writers who, stop the story, give the history, and then go back. They're not doing it for people like you and I who will go Google stuff. They're doing it for the people who don't do any research, so it has to be included.
Roger, there's also another historical perspective, which I suppose that the name of the book is tied to. And that is the reason why he was on the island in the first place. So she's talking about what existed in terms of these cedar trees and the fact that Bermuda had more land space and now it's covered by the rising tide. And that I felt was her telling two stories, and quite skillfully as well, because to the environmentalists, they will find that part of the book very intriguing, and she was able to weave both of them all throughout the novel, and I mean that is, I'm not a historian like Eric or Kessel, but to me that's a scientific historical perspective of the book that she brought into to the narrative. And also I wonder if it wasn't a metaphor for the forgetfulness of the drowned forest, the fact that these things were there and then somebody found the evidence in a root, okay, but I wonder if that wasn't a metaphor for Bermudans in their current modern state, aspiring to be rich, like these super rich people who they see, in these marinas and all the offshore banking that goes on there and so on, and not identifying with the past, and I may be reading too much into it, Roger, but the root of the cedar tree is a metaphor for something else. That's how I felt.
Right? Definitely, the root is a metaphor. It's a very important metaphor. You remember that conversation that Nina had with Genesis when Nina was trying to grow an avocado, and there was Genesis. They were asking about. The conversation came up about what was the most important part, and Genesis was insisting that it was a seed, and Nina said, "No, it's the root. The root promises new growth." And then there's so there is that metaphor about the root, and then there's a metaphor about drowning. You remember that Nina's niece was baptized, and essentially the metaphor, what the preacher was saying something about is that you drown the old you and the new you arises. So I think she plays with the drowning metaphor beautifully throughout the novel. Very often, I shouldn't say throughout, but very often. And she also plays with the root metaphor very often throughout the novel. This is one of the things I loved about the novel too. This is a really skillfully constructed novel. It's really amazingly skillful. But that is for a longer conversation.
I definitely agree with the metaphors as well, because even with the concept of the root, towards the end of the novel, when I think it was Tess was renovating her property and they went into the cellar, she started digging in the cellar and she found, I don't want to reveal too much, but she found the remnants of enslavement. Let me put it that way. In her cellar, buried for, I'm assuming, centuries. And I think that's the whole concept of the root, and of Buddy Darrell finding the root so close, because I think he was just like 30 meters offshore or 30 meters down below, either one of them. I think that was a metaphor for showing that there are things that are buried in Bermudian society that people forget. They go about their daily lives not remembering all these things, not even thinking about them, but these are things that are still there and that can haunt the society. So I think that was quite a powerful metaphor.
I think that's what her project does as well, right? It's exactly that. It's one small project, a school project, but it evokes and it creates and it sets off so many different things, because she starts talking about a past that is not as far away as everyone would have her believe, right? She's a young woman in the early 2000s investigating events 80 years ago. Most of the people she knows weren't even born then, but yet they're all so affected by those events that when she starts to ask questions, all of their lives are different. And all she does really is a school project. And I think one of the things, sorry, Paula, that I love about the novel is the way that I think that's such a picture of Caribbean history. So many episodes of history in the Caribbean live in the minds of the people who are the descendants of those who lived through them, or the communities that lived through them, and are not written down. That story is not written down. Genesis at 17 is going to do a school project, and that's going to get written down for the first time. And like you were saying about the youth, Francine, you see that the adults are like, you don't know about this person, and they all know that. And I had a really similar experience teaching in Martinique, where I'd done some research. I wanted to know more about it, so like a good teacher, set my students a project, go and find out about this thing. And one of them did it really seriously and went around, and I said, you have to go and ask old people, who is this person? And they'd be like, we don't know. They came back and they were like, Miss, this guy. I asked all my grandparents, I asked my aunties, and they had all these stories about this person that I couldn't find any information about as a professional historian. But in asking in their communities, the elders, they were able to find, and they, my students, didn't know about them, growing up in that same community only 60 years later. But in talking to their elders, they were able to recreate massive amounts of history that is literally not written. And I think the way that she recounted that experience that I have had, and that I'm sure many people trying to study histories that are unwritten have had, was magical. I loved it.
And for that reason, I do not believe that Genesis's name is Genesis for no reason. I think it's very significant. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's what Kesha's point is, the importance of the characters of Rosie, Uncle Jack, and Avo. They are the links to the past. And when a society or a community ignores their elders and fail to engage their elders and ask them questions, then you reap the consequences of a past that remains buried. But still, you live with the realities and legacies of the past. But we find ourselves floundering because we don't have answers to the questions that we have, and sometimes we don't even ask the questions. We just think that this is the way things were supposed to be, instead of investigating and interrogating and thinking, oh, this event caused that event and this event caused that event. So I think those elders in the story is so important. And I think even Rosie's situation is, I think, is part of the tragedy. It's a real tragic moment, because I think Angela Berry is making a really, really sharp point about disconnection, and intergenerational disconnection. So I'll leave it at that, because I don't want to reveal too much to our audience about Rosie.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. So I think where Eric is going is sort of answering the question of, would you agree that Rosie, Avo, and Uncle Jack play a healing role in the novel? And I think they do. They play a great healing role for the whole Bermudian community. And they might be sort of forgotten because, for example, Uncle Jack just wanders around. He appears to be senile, so he would be easily forgotten. And I think that in itself is a metaphor for Bermudian society. These are people that exist typically in Bermuda, but in the hustle and bustle of all this financial services and all these things, that tourism, etc., Bermudians forget that these people exist.
I don't think that's just a Bermudian thing, though. I think she's making a point that we can all apply to our communities. Like, how many of us take the time? Because I think in Lizzie's case with her Avo, she's lived in the same house with her whole life. But this person is a marginalized member of her family. And so she never took her seriously until she needed to. And when she did, the wealth of knowledge and the love and care that she was able to access, she could not have possibly imagined it. And that marginal figure became central to her own life merely because she took the time to actually see it, understand it, figure it out on its own terms. I'm saying it like it's not a person. But I think there's something really important that Angela Barry is telling us there. Like, how many of us dismiss people because other people tell us to?
I don't want to give you some problems to resolve, Roger, in terms of time, but I want to, as you brought up the elder folk, and I found them to be like pacifists, and I'm asking myself the question: is the healing nature of a person come along with a pacifist sort of character? I'm
pacifist? Tony, did you meet Rosie?
Well, yeah.
Pacifist?
I think there was a
Rosie
lot of that
bigs
going
up
on
her
with
chest to a young man.
Yeah, but let's not give up that was like putting him in his place at that point.
Even Avo, who questions, I mean, she's a devout Catholic and questions the Catholic teachings on women and reproduction, and
well, maybe
don't you drop and lick your head? Pacifist?
Maybe it's a stronger term, but these people survived the onslaught of what the current generation didn't have to go through. You know, they're closer to that incident where the people were removed from their land, and then the Bermuda went along. They were dispossessed. You know, the modern the investors that came in and got this modern economy going and so on. So to me, why I thought of pacifism is that you have to survive and to be sane in conditions like that. You've got to maybe compromise is the better word. But I just found that they weren't like Nina's husband, who said,
I think there are more than one ways to skin a cat. I don't think because they weren't willing to throw
they did it the Martin
set things
Luther
on
way.
fire. It's not. I don't even think it's the Martin Luther way. I think they just had a different way of dealing with the realities around them. And I think it's worth pointing out we never saw them as young people. We know that Dee's husband went to throw and put things alive, but we don't know how Avo was as a young person. We don't know what Uncle Jack was like as a young person. We get a sense of who Rosie was as a young person.
I mean, Uncle Jack was a Gambe. So,
yeah, so I don't
know,
think there's any sense that they're necessarily pacifistic. Is that a word?
Yeah,
okay.
they were more like quiet revolutionaries.
And they're
They
old,
weren't
they're working within
right.
the physical
Mm.
constraints that the bodies that we meet them in. Like, but when they were young and lithe, who knows how they were and what their
Sorry,
personalities
Roger.
required.
Sorry for bringing that curveball into the game.
No, no. I think you spiced up the discussion towards the end of the show. So, but one thing I want to squeeze in here is: do you see any thematic similarities between the Drowned Forest and the Island of Forgetting, or any other books that we have done? And if so, which themes stood out for you? And while you're doing it, if you want, you could also give your rating of the novel. So, who wants to start?
I can start with that. I definitely saw connections between Jasmine Seeley's book and this one. Specifically regarding Genesis and her desire to leave. And that's understandable because of her situation. And from what we get toward the end, she finally leaves. um but there's also this sense of returning, and I think that's the thing. She's the youngest of the characters. The youngest of the characters in Island Forgetting leaves and comes back. And I think where Angela Barry leaves the story, I think it's open. It seems as though Genesis will return. So I saw that though between Genesis and the youngest character in Island Forgetting. So my rating is 4 out of 5. Very good. Opened up a lot of questions for me to investigate regarding Bermudan history. I bought a book on slavery and slavery in Bermuda that should be coming today or yesterday.
Thank you.
Roger, I have to be
Tony?
consistent with
Yep.
how I rated this book on Goodreads. So let me just get that out. It's a 5 for me. Did I see any similarities? Yeah, I identified with what Eric said. I didn't compare, mind you, Barbados and Bermuda together. That's for sure not a similar theme. But and in terms of the layers of the society and how those were brought out in the book, yes. But to my rating, a 5.
Right. Paula?
Definitely a 5. This is a brilliant novel. Um, this is so beautifully layered. The construction was just marvelous. Like just in terms of the narrative craft. The narrative craft of this novel is amazing. Similarities between the Drowned Forest and the Island of Forgetting. The two young women. Genesis and Calypso. Very, very similar characters. That's it.
Francine?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the similarities with other books, but in fact, now that we're talking about it, definitely there is that similarity with the Island of Forgetting, especially, Genesis and Calypso and their relationships with white expats, to be specific. Um, I quite like the book. It's a solid 4 for me.
Kasua?
I have a list of similarities, so I'll try and be brief. The ways that she talks about the water and the physical beauty and the way it means so much to them, and the way it changes their lives and and a kind of big event for me reminded me Leonie Ross's This One Day Sky. I think the Islands of Forgetting memory question definitely. Not so much the white expat story. Now you say it, I'm like, oh yeah, but for me it was actually the theme of memory and memories lost and the power of remembering. And the other story for me was how the one-armed sister sweeps her house. Again, the kind of ability to heal intergenerational traumas, what happens in the past and how it affects the present, but also Mermaid of Black Conch, all the different people that reside in one small space and how they interact in the present and the past. Also love that it's set slightly in the past. When you start reading it, you think it's 2023 and you write, why is she using cassettes? What year is this? And then you realize it's actually set in sort of 20 years ago. So wonderful novel, easily 4.5 for me. The only reason I'm not giving it a 5 is because I'm being a bit stingy. There's no other real reason. It didn't. One thing I will say, it was a real page turner. I started reading it on the train. I got off the train. I was walking down the street reading my book. I got to my office. I was like, oh, I guess I have to close it. I was loving this book. I read
Sounds
it
like
really
a 5
quick.
to me, Castle.
I know it
Yeah.
does, doesn't it? It's 4.75, but it didn't.
Stop
it
being
didn't-
stingy.
Maybe 4.75. There's something that means I think I didn't love any of the characters enough personally to make it a 5 for me. I didn't fall in love with anybody. Like I loved the novel, but I didn't. Yeah, it wasn't a 5, but it was real close. I
Right.
didn't
Yeah,
find it-
I agree. I like nothing. I wasn't swept away. It was engrossing, and I actually stayed up really late to finish it a couple nights ago, much later than I planned. And I couldn't stop reading. I was like, I have to finish. I have to finish. But yet, I wasn't swept away, and I didn't fall in love with any of the characters. So yeah, I think that's why it's solid 4 still.
But I will add, I do agree with Paula in terms of the way that it ends. Like it's not a neat happy ending in the way that you think it might be. I really love the way that the story ends appropriately. It doesn't end at a flashy point where it's a nice winding up story. Like it really gets into the meat of these characters in their lives. Sorry, Roger, I can never stop talking. This was a great book. It's a great book, everyone. Read it.
No problem at all, because I liked how you linked it to almost all the other books that we've reviewed before. But for me, I definitely saw the thematic similarities between the Drowned Forest and the Island of Forgetting, especially between Hugh and Odie. Odie being in Island of Forgetting, and definitely, as Eric mentioned, the sort of wanting to leave the island, but there is still some room for returning. So for me, I give it a 4 out of 5. I think that would be my rating. That would be the end of our show. That would be the end of our review of The Drowned Forest by Angela Barry. The next time you see us and hear from us, we'll be interviewing Angela Barry.